unless I hear the introduction. Okay, and I'm going to introduce John Shannon Hendrix, who, with Francesco Proto, were the valiant souls who volunteered to be editors of this book. And if you've ever edited an anthology dealing with academics, you'll know this is akin to um, combat heroics. John and Francisco did a fantastic job of marshaling the unruly editors, getting them to the point of publication. We were also really handily assisted by Derek Cook and Caleb Neal, who were the editors of the series, the Palgrave Lacan series. And Beth Farrow was very helpful in at all stages of the development. So with those thanks, let me introduce John Shannon Hendrix.
Thank you. I think it would be more accurate to say that I was appointed as co-editor rather than volunteered. So we're here to launch our book, Lacan plus Architecture. This is the online version of the launch. And there'll be other in-person launches later on in London. So I'd just like to read my prepared statement for a couple minutes, and then we'll have each author summarize their chapters in the order of the chapters. Unfortunately, Angie Voela couldn't be here today. She's the only one of us who is missing. The purpose of Lacan plus architecture is to expand thinking about architecture for the benefit of architectural practice. The right philosophy and the right psychoanalysis have a great deal to offer architecture so that architecture can improve the human condition. Social practices impair the production of good architecture. A healthy psyche and a good understanding of the psyche can go a long way towards a better architectural practice, a kind of practice that facilitates good relations between people and psychical and social growth. Architecture, in turn, has much to offer the theories of psychoanalysis in understanding the structure of the unconscious and spatial relations between conscious and unconscious thought. The contributors to the book have been collaborating with each other for many years, between 5 and 25. The book is an outgrowth of those collaborations and previous projects. Our organization, IPSA, the Institute for Psychoanalytic Studies in Architecture, has a website, ipsa.psu.edu, and regular meetings, Zoom conferences, and other projects to support the ongoing interest in the reciprocal relation between psychoanalysis and architecture. We welcome you to join us, and thank you for joining us today. We are honored that this book is part of the Palgrave Lacan series edited by Derek Cook and Caleb Neal, organized by Beth Farrow at Palgrave Springer. Thanks to Francesco, the book was shortlisted for the Architectural Book of the Year award sponsored by Book Launch in London. That is the reason for our book launch today. A party and award ceremony will be held at Leighton House in London on July 23rd. An in-person book launch will take place at the Architecture Association in London in October, organized by Lorens Holm. The book can be purchased for a discount at the book launch bookshop page, uk.bookshop.org, and I think that Palgrave is currently offering a discount as well if you go to their website. Uh, so that's it for the introduction. We'll just I'll say a few words about Angie's paper since she's not here today, and then Tim, Fran, Don, Lawrence, Andy, and me will briefly summarize our papers. And we've decided to leave questions and comments for afterwards. Hopefully we can have a discussion or any response. Uh, no, we haven't. We were just talking about how there hasn't been much critical response to the book yet. I mean, that takes a while. It was just published, but It'd be very interesting if anybody has any responses to it at this point. So chapter three is there's a foreword and an introduction. Then chapter three is by Angie Voela, who unfortunately she couldn't be here today. She's in Dublin, I think. She played a vital role in the generation of the book project. She's a reader in social sciences at the University of East London. Her chapter is entitled Adam's House on Earth, Architectural and Libidinal Tensions in Lars von Trier's The House That Jack Built. Angie explores the relation between architecture and normal psychical functioning and psychosis. She addresses such questions as how does architecture reveal psychical malfunction, tension, inability to connect language and visualization, and the inability to connect the individual and society? How does architecture reveal the tensions between the human being and the environment? To what extent does architecture create a barrier or division between the human being and the environment? To what extent does the ego-driven practice of architecture threaten and destroy nature and/or the unconscious mind and psychic equilibrium? How are the absence of the subject and the void around which desire circulates manifest in architecture? How is the fragmentation of the environment related to the fragmentation of the body and the fragmentation of the psyche? In order to address these questions, Angie's essay focuses primarily on the film The House That Jack Built by Lars von Trier. Drawing on Lacan's seminar on anxiety, this essay highlights Lacan's psychotectonic thinking and how Lacanian psychoanalysis and architecture enrich one another as parallel approaches to contemporary ontology. So, really fantastic essay by Angie to start the book off. So, Tim, uh, would you like to say a few words about your chapter?
Yeah, thank you, John. My chapter is called The Architect in the Clinic of Obsessional Neurosis. And it explores, as the title suggests, the possibility of designing therapeutic domestic environments for individuals with obsessional neurosis. My central question is how architecture, in conjunction with psychoanalysis, can contribute to healing or managing such conditions. Now, historically, what I'm suggesting is a rather new idea. In the past, architects collaborated with behavioral and environmental psychology for the most part. But more recently, architecture theorists interested in psychoanalysis, such as Mark Cousins and Anthony Vidler and John Kopchak, have developed the relationship between these two fields, but all along have expressed a certain amount of skepticism about whether psychoanalysis can actually offer therapeutic design solutions for neurosis, because the causes of such neuroses are not architectural or spatial, they are psychosexual. Now, while the cause of obsessional neurosis may not be architectural, I propose in my chapter that a spatial psychotherapy could potentially aid the talking cure by passively reinforcing therapeutic methods. However, this would require a considered method of collaboration between the architect and the analyst. To help develop my idea of a spatial psychotherapy, my chapter presents a case study of Ottavio, a 17-year-old Italian male diagnosed with severe OCD, and the story of his sister, an architect who attempted to design a therapeutic home for him in consultation with his psychiatrist. So in the course of this case study, I examined Ottavio's drawings of his ideal home, which I asked him to draw, and found in them clinical insights into his symptoms and desires in spatial form. For example, his circular bedroom design was driven by a dislike of dusty corners, and the presence of symbolic elements such as a library represented his reliance on ritualistic language. His drawing of a calming subaquatic fantasy scene for his living room included fish and shrimp and an underwater fireplace, and also revealed absences of objects like his family's piano connected to a traumatic sexual event that started his OCD. I track how the architect and the psychiatrist discussed the risk of building Ottavio's designs for fear of feeding the monster of his ever-shifting obsessions. But in the end, they could not move beyond matters of door locks and security. So, drawing on Lacanian technique, my chapter develops this case study by proposing two speculative methods for a spatial psychotherapy co-created by an architect and an analyst. My first method was to explore domestic objects as a big other. This method positioned the object or the architect in creating it in the place of the law-making other, like the name of the father, to regulate excessive enjoyment and guide the subject back to desire. I highlight the significant potential here of artificial intelligence image generation in facilitating these methods, allowing for quick creation and testing of visual design solutions during clinical sessions. Examples in the book here include creating an aquarium with a small figure of Ottavio inside to help him see himself from the position of the other, or subtly modifying an object he fears, like the piano, perhaps by incorporating his subaquatic fantasy scene into it to help him re-encounter his desire. I also compare this method with cognitive behavioral therapies for OCD, like imagery rescripting, exposure response prevention, and inference-based therapy, noting their very different theoretical groundings and approaches to symptoms. I also take up a second design method using domestic architecture as the objet or the semblant. This is a riskier method that positions the architecture itself as a semblant, an object representing surplus enjoyment that confronts the obsessional with hints of the drives that they try to avoid. Using AI image generation, I explore possible room or architectural elements, such as the room of the shrimp, which was derived from his drawing, and incorporates its symbolic references to his castrated desire and phallic enjoyment in a way that is unavoidable but mediated. The aim here is to help him accept and integrate aspects of his jouissance. And so, in conclusion, I suggest in this chapter that contrary to historical skepticism, some form of spatial psychotherapy is theoretically possible, and that AI image generation now makes collaborative design processes much more practical. The major challenges lie in further developing the theoretical framework, the practical implementation, and the assessment methods. And I would welcome contact from any analysts here interested in further pursuing this research. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Excellent summary. Fran?
Hello, everybody. I hope that the background noise is not overwhelming because I'm in the middle of end of the year exhibition. This was the best spots I could find, so I apologize about that. I haven't got anything to read because any summary would have been, to me, unsatisfactory. I approached this study that has been lasting for many years now and has consisted of 3 different publications with IPSA since 2016, and before that, other publication on the journal Baudrillard Studies, combining Jean Baudrillard and Jacques Lacan as a methodology. And I have many different research questions, possibly the most important of which being, in what way do we project our subjectivity as human mankind onto the built environment? This is in opposition, or actually, no, is an integration of Shannon Hendrix' own study of what could be or should be a subject-led architecture. John specifically say we should stop projecting our subjectivity into the built environment. And my question was of the kind, how do we do that actually? In order to answer this question and therefore indirectly try to find a link between a contemporary phenomenon, which is it's not schizophrenia, it's been going on for a very long time, but is actually narcissism. What was the relationship between this phenomenon, narcissism, as we can witness to it across the socials, as we call them in Italian, the social platforms, but possibly all level of society, not just in stardom, but even in everyday life, and architecture. To answer this question, I've been using a post-structuralist approach, specifically genealogy, to go back to what I believe is the origin of the contemporary paradigm shift, which is the Renaissance, and specifically the invention of the perspective window. And in order to do that, I've been building on two masters in my known research cluster. John himself with his research on Renaissance philosophy, and Lorens Holmes and his analysis of the field of vision from the three Lacanian clinics of the neurotics, the psychotic, and the pervert. And for the first time, possibly in the history of psychoanalysis, of architecture, or cultural studies, or whatever you want to call it, I gave a structure to this evolution, going possibly from the neurotic subject and the invention of modern subjectivity to what I define as the modernist pervert, and then finally to the postmodern schizophrenic. Therefore, trying to understand what is actually could be the development of this attitude toward contemporary reality. In doing this, I've been bringing together the field of studies that I embraced and enjoyed as a PhD student, which are visual critical theory, and psychoanalysis. And I came up with what I define as the elliptical subject of postmodernity. To cut a long story short, I see the contemporary city as the outcome or leftover of a process of mirror staging with the figure of God during the Renaissance, which was set for the human mankind as, at the time, possibly impossible achievements to reach for a man that was made in the image and resemblance of this God, but then little by little has been replaced by an artificial construction of paradise on earth, which is the contemporary city, whatever it might be. So it's a complex theorization that I'm now trying to pull into a book entitled tentatively Narcissism and the City. But what I really want to say about this is the valuable collaboration we had within this group, IPSA itself, for which I invite all of you to give us the permission to contact you for future endeavors, because it's something I've really enjoyed so far, and what I'm doing actually wouldn't be possible without the strict collaboration with my friends and colleagues.
Thank you, Francesco. Excellent summary. Great invitation. Don?
Thank you, John, and thank you, Francesco. I really had a marvelous time engaged in this project because I ran into a lot of people in the course of trying to write it and in the course of trying to understand what I had written. I had met before Carol Owens, Stephanie Swales, Sheldon George, a lot of people in the APW at the LAC meetings, and just tried to gauge their interest in architecture. And of course, there's a lot of confusion about what architecture would ever have to say to Lacanians. Uh, and I thought, well, maybe this book can help. In the process of writing my essays, I have, I think, three notable heroes. And I started to say unsung heroes, but since one of them is Joan Kopchik, she's quite well sung. And so the other two are only comparatively lesser sung. One is Jim Egan, who we have here, and the third is slightly lesser sung, at least these days, George Spencer Brown, who is a mathematician who worked in England on a very strange project called Laws of Form. Um, it's not that I am in the business of resurrecting people who are actually already quite famous or well known and deserving. It's just that I found that their work needed to be put together in a strategic way. Um, as for Joan Kopchik, we tried to get her famous essay reprinted, and that didn't work out. That would be the article she wrote years ago called A Strut of Vision. I tried to summarize her main arguments and carry it forward to look at Jim Egan's work in Newport, Rhode Island. Jim has been concerned with a strange structure that's been around for a long time, variously called a mill or some kind of tower. It's in Truro Park, And in researching this, Jim has heroically found that in fact it was a Tempietto, possibly designed by John Dee. That would make it the first and only Renaissance building in the United States. Something I think that would merit headlines of 57 point type on the New York Times, but it's not yet mainstream in they're showing you some copies of it. Um, this building brought together things that I found were quite consistent with Kopchik's idea of an ahistoricist Lacan. That is, a Lacan not divided into the standard stages of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, but rather a Lacan whose topology is extended to the very beginning of his academic output. In making this case, I found that Kopchik had already done the main heavy lifting by correctly citing the origins of projective geometry, which is Girard Desargues, who was drawing upon the work of a predecessor, Pappus of Alexandria. In bringing her case forward, I found that Kopchik had just done everything correctly, and it marveled me that this essay had not received more attention. Not to say that it hasn't been well received, but connecting it to works of architecture and then using it to connect architecture to psychoanalysis seemed to me to be one of the things that almost everyone in Lacan world would enjoy doing. So I'm just going to tie it up there, and if you have any questions, I'll answer them later. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Excellent summary. Lawrence is up next. I think he has to leave afterwards to go to graduation. So,
Yeah, no, thanks. The irony of this is that everyone's been racing through their presentation in about 5 minutes, and I sketched up some notes here, which will probably take me about 10 minutes. So I'll try and cut
well,
it. I'll try and cut it down. I didn't realize that we were if there was a temporal framework. Anyway,
we did that to make sure that you could give your presentation.
right. Well, I really appreciate that. No, we have, like Francesco just said, we're in the middle of the degree show and award ceremonies and at the moment. Anyway, my paper's called My Neighbor, Myself in the Ethics of Architecture and Psychoanalysis. And the according to the three great world religions of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, the figure of the neighbor is regarded as the prime site for our ethical responsibility to the other. And the religious edict, love thy neighbor as thyself, is one of the few religious edicts that most atheists would assent to. And I wanted to discuss the neighbor, the figure of the neighbor, because it seems to me to be one of the places where architecture and psychoanalysis come together. Okay, the neighbor is obviously a territorial figure relating to architecture, and the neighbor is also an ethical figure, which Lacan discusses at length in Seminar 7, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. Now, Lacan's treatment of the neighbor in the ethics is threefold, or at least I'm going to present three approaches. Firstly, he attacks the overtly narcissistic form of the formula, love thy neighbor as thyself, and argues that any morality that emerges from the neighbor or from this edict is fundamentally narcissistic and bound up with the implicit sadism of the superego. I do good to others essentially because it reflects well on me, and I do good to others because otherwise I'll torment myself. Okay. He also puts love thy neighbor as thyself in relation to one of Freud's quotes, where it was, there the subject must come to be. He says that the it refers to the unconscious, and the must has the force of a moral, an ethical imperative. So Lacan is essentially saying that if we reject the narcissistic morality of the neighbor, we can recover a certain form of ethics with a subject who is essentially born into their unconscious and whose ethical duty then is to inhabit their unconscious and follow it where it leads. And that, he says, is the aim of an ethics of analysis. Okay. Finally, Lacan relates the figure of the neighbor to das Ding, what he calls the Freudian thing. In Lacan's reading of Freud's early text, The Project for a Scientific Psychology, the figure of the Nebenmensch, or next man, is where we first encounter the irreducible and intractable alterity of the other that we also subsequently encounter in ourself. I think of it, this isn't Lacan, but the way I think of it as the kernel of the subject, stripped of its identifying features, stripped of any capacity for representation, a kind of irreducible remainder, which is unassimilable to our linguistic systems, our thought, our capacity to represent it, but which is also the principle of our enduring coherence. So this kind of irreducible otherness to myself that I find in myself. Okay, so that's Lacan on the neighbor, putting it in relation to a subject of the unconscious. The treatment of the neighbor in architecture goes primarily through the figure of the party wall, in particular, party wall procedures and legislation on the one hand, and what I call party wall stories on the other, principally the story of Pyramus and Thisbe and its iteration, Romeo and Juliet, which relates the party wall to the romantic love of one neighbor to another. And I should just say to those of you who don't know, I'm an architect. I teach history and theory of architecture, and for some reasons, it's probably a perverse reason, I have found myself more and more attached to party walls. Now, what is so extraordinary about party walls is their mute, lumpen, unadorned character. They're only exposed when the building next door is torn down. Piranesi in etchings have a good line in effectively party walls. What is so extraordinary about party wall procedures is that they're about managing your identity, the subject's identity, having to do with their proximity to an essentially alien other. Okay? And in party wall stories, the love of Pyramus and Thisbe is fraught and freighted with anxiety and death, as if the closeness of their neighborly love were a threat to their love, or perhaps a threat to their neighborliness. So I spend most of the paper trying to put the architecture and the Lacan's treatment of the neighbor, the architect's treatment of it in Lacan's, in some kind of opposition, mostly through the vehicle of the party wall story. So I conclude by relating this fraught love, as it appears in party wall stories, to the psychoanalytic account of the death drive, in particular to what I describe as the oscillating relation of the scopic drive and the invocatory drive, their relations to each other. It's an oscillating relation, I argue, at least as it appears in party wall stories. This is a claim that goes beyond Lacan's account of the drive, or Freud's. In Lacan's text, there are 4 partial drives, of which 2 are operative in these stories: the scopic drive, whose object is the gaze, and the invocatory drive, whose object is the voice. The corresponding bodies, organs are the eye and the ear, sight and hearing, etc. These are the two drives that relate to unconscious desire, and somewhere going back to where it was there, the subjects shall be. In the story, Pyramus and Thisbe whisper their love to each other through a defect in the party wall that separates the domiciles of their respective families. In Romeo and Juliet, the party wall isn't there, and that's probably why they get into more arguments with each other, the two families. Pyramus and Thisbe, they either put their ear to the wall to hear their lover, this little hole in the wall, or they put their eye to the wall to see their lover. But they cannot do both at the same time. They can either hear their lover but not see them, or see them but not hear them through that little hole. As the story goes, the two lovers are kept separate from each other until death. It's a kind of inverse version of Until Death Do We Part. But behind this separation is this other separation, this incapacity when confronted with the intense closeness of this other and its unbearable alterity, even when the other is their lover, and perhaps precisely because the other is a lover. It's to keep the scopic and invocatory drives operating simultaneously. It's the incapacity for them to keep them together, to hold, in other words, gaze and voice together, to see and hear the lover at the same time. Okay. Now, this is where I'm most speculative and where more work clearly needs to be done to clarify the potential implications of this story for our understanding of the drives. As I said, it goes beyond Freud and Lacan's accounts. I should also add that I put forward a kind of a Lacanian matheme or formula for this repeated displacement between gaze and voice, which I call cross-inscription, which only makes things even more confusing and not at all clarifying. Anyway, but this repeated displacement between gaze and voice, it's based on the idea that the subject recognizes its gaze in the other, this being the root of love, which goes right back to Lacan's reading of Freud's treatment of Das Ding and the irreducible alterity of the other. Anyway, just to conclude, if we step back from the minutiae for a moment, what's so extraordinary is that through the agency of the party wall, architecture holds and positions the lovers' love for each other, and in a very real sense keeps it, the love, not the lovers, alive by preventing or deferring a certain form of unification of the drive, which is tantamount to death. Another interesting thing about it is it's not exactly the wall itself, but it's the hole in the wall, okay? And not even a hole like a peephole. It's actually a defect in the wall, as it's an accident in the wall, okay? Now, I think I'm going to stop there, but just to say that love and unconscious desire are not exactly the same thing. I mean, it's obviously more complicated than this, but unconscious desire is obviously bound up with conscious love, and it's so it might not exactly be the love that would die if the two component drives came together, but certainly their unconscious desire for each other would. Okay, I better stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorens. Excellent summary. Have a good graduation. As I listen to these summaries, I think about all the conversations we've had in Zoom meetings over years and years, and how these summaries are a product of all of those ideas being generated. Andy? Mute, unmute.
My apologies. Speaking of, I guess I was for a second there a bit in Thisbe's, I could see, but I couldn't hear. Anyway, speaking to your point, John, some of you will notice, I think, a degree of affinity, even overlap between Lauren's paper and mine. And that I would say that that affinity is very much, before briefly summarizing my paper, my chapter, I would say that that affinity is very much a product of the dialogues that Lorens and I had the pleasure of having around the seventh seminar in preparation for our respective contributions to the volume. And as some of you may remember, Lorens and I, in the course of preparing for the volume, had a kind of public dialogue, at least public in front of the other IPSA members. And I can't tell you how invaluable both my conversations with Lorens and then the discussion that came out of our respective presentations were for my final contribution to the volume. About which now I'll just say a few things, and I'll be fairly brief, partly because at this late stage, my recollection of what I actually did in that chapter is a little hazy, I confess. But I do recall that I undertook to do at least three things. And the first was to place Lacan's references to architecture in his seventh seminar, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. Lacan does mention architecture in other places, but in the seventh seminar, he speaks at some length about architecture on two occasions. So I wanted to place those two references in the context of his description of artistic sublimation as, to use his phrase, the elevation of the object to the dignity of a thing. So that was my first goal or aim in this chapter. The second was then to situate that formula within the context of his broader treatment of the thing, das Ding. And my third was to highlight the degree to which his interest in the thing is informed by an early and perduring preoccupation with the singular rapport that human animals establish with their environments as a result of the helplessness, the Hilflosigkeit, to use the Freudian term, that marks the earliest stages of their development. So two questions then. How is Freud's thing implicated in both the motivations that inform the act of artistic sublimation and that environmental debility resulting from premature natality? And then further, how are these two themes implicated in one another? So in my chapter, these questions provided what I might describe as the interrogatory framework in which I attempted to place architecture as both object of aesthetic veneration and territorial dispositif against the background of the seminar's broadest theoretical ambitions. So that was my kind of tripartite undertaking in this paper. The paper is comprised of 4 sections. The first, from an ethology of the person to a psychoanalysis of the subject, identified Lacan's preoccupation with the human organism's rapport with its environment as already a central concern in his pre-psychoanalytic writings, his dissertation on paranoid psychosis most especially, and considers the decisive inflection to which that preoccupation is subject with his turn to Freud, with his turn to psychoanalysis, which is more or less contemporary, as I point out in the paper, with a pivot from Spinoza to Hegel. But I won't discuss that on this occasion. So that inflection that occurs with the turn to psychoanalysis concerns first and foremost the extent to which the human animal's environmental rapport is mediated by the organism's first relation to a human counterpart. And that brings us to the paper's second section, the Nebenmensch thing, in which I treat Lacan's reading of Freud's discussion of the Nebenmensch as a privileged topos for his consideration of how the subject's earliest dealings with this counterpart shape its environmental experience. And this consideration also opens on to the question of the thing as Lacan inherited from Freud. In the end, elaborating on this discussion of Lacan's approach to the Nebenmensch thing, the third section of my paper, at the nexus of object and thing, concerning Lacan's theory of sublimation, introduces Lacan's general theory of sublimation, which is distinct from Freud's, and then examines his specific formula for artistic as against religious or scientific sublimation, the famous elevation of the object to the dignity of a thing. Then the paper's final section, from the illusion of space to the creation of emptiness, architecture in the seventh seminar, examines Lacan's references to architecture with a view to revealing how they extend and refine his theory of artistic sublimation and his understanding of art's interest for psychoanalysis more broadly. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Andy. Great paper. Excellent summary.
Thanks.
So I'll just take a couple of minutes to summarize my paper from my prepared statement, and then we can open the floor up to any questions, comments, critiques that anybody might have. I think this has been a good summation of what's in the book, so what you can expect. The purpose of my chapter on a subjectless architecture is to suggest an architecture that can dissolve the barrier between the subject as ego and the environment, and an architecture that can be generated through the unconscious. The aphonesis, or fading of the subject in language, according to Lacan, the sliding of the subject under signification and representation, defines the division of the subject and its alienation from itself. The subjectless architecture aims toward a regenerative relation between the subject as ego, based on Lacan's imaginary order and the environment, and between architecture and the human condition. The conceptualization of the unconscious tells us that consciousness is an illusion based in image-based ego formation and the orthopedic totality of the body, its alienating armor, in the mirror stage. We must overcome the barrier between ourselves and our surroundings through psychoanalysis and architecture. We must overcome the barrier between our closed systems of thinking and the world around us. We must stop projecting our egos into the world and be absorbed by it. Lacanian concepts such as the real, what is inaccessible to conscious thought, the symbolic, the linguistic structure of the unconscious, the other, with a big O, the matrix of relations in which the subject is inserted, the objet petit a, the incompletion of the subject in language and perception, and its displaced desire, and méconnaissance, the inability of the subject to know itself, along with the imaginary or conscious ego formation, can contribute to a rethinking of architecture in relation to the human being. These concepts can also be thought of in relation to the dream space of Sigmund Freud, the psychophysiological space of Erwin Panofsky, the heterogeneous space of Georges Bataille, and the psychasthenia of Roger Caillois, for the purpose of dissolving boundaries and creating a built environment that fosters peaceful and supportive relations and psychological and intellectual growth. Architecture, in turn, has much to offer the theories of psychoanalysis and understanding the structure of the unconscious and spatial relations between conscious and unconscious thought. So that concludes the summary of the book. We would be very interested if anybody has any response, questions, comments, criticisms, complaints?
I think this should be where we don't say, okay, audience, we've done our bit now, you respond, but where we should like open a bottle of wine, actually. That's
We,
what
we do have a question. Cornelius Alfrank?
I see a Calum here. Is that Calum Neal? Is he here?
Oh, definitely. Oh, uh, Igor Farden has raised his hand.
Yes, I think Alicia was before me. Alicia, pronounce it
Okay.
correctly. You can go first, and then I'll go after.
Okay.
Thank you, Igor. Yeah, it's Alicia. Thank you. Yeah, these sound really fascinating. I can't wait to buy the book and read all of your essays and have a more profound understanding of what you're presenting today. But I'm particularly interested in a specific element that Francesco spoke about, which is his concept of, I think he called it something like a modernist pervert. I'm not sure. I don't know that we have any time to really go through what that might mean, but this piques my interest a lot. So yeah, it just sounds really fascinating. I'd love to know a little bit more about what goes into that.
Thanks a lot. That was the most complex chapter I've been working on, because I had to build on Lacan, but also on Lacanian interpretation. I've applied specifically a Lacanian understanding of the Freudian pervert to modernist architecture and what it meant to have an anal understanding of the environment around us. It's built in different stages, but I found an analogy between architects and artists from the first artistic avant-garde, specifically from the beginning of the past century up until World War II. And I've been trying to explain that specific attitude. My position is that since the Renaissance, where both architects and painters used to overlap in their understanding of the environment and shaping our understanding of the environment, especially in terms of architectural representation, that has later become a sort of a microchip through which we perceive the environments, for example, through the perspective window, however it may be vanishing now. Through all of these, I try to make the point that they open the way to a new way of understanding reality in its entirety. And that's why Jean Baudrillard comes into the way, because the final articulation of all this path from 5 centuries ago, of course, is the virtualization of the environments, which doesn't mean that the world is becoming more and more screened out or turned into an image, but it actually there's no longer any difference between the representation of reality and reality itself, which is a completely different thing that very few have understood from Baudrillard. And therefore, I try to triangulate these with the specific cultural paradigm that was informing this ideology. And of course, Lacanian mirror staging and understanding of the field of vision. And that's why, of course, Lorens Holm was coming into the way. I wouldn't say any further than that. It's much better to read the chapter. I'm very happy to forward it to you. It might be available online. But it is a complex, at least for me, path that it is much more difficult to articulate in person than to be read on the paper.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I would like to, in the end, I was trying to understand what are the different positions from both Lacan and Freud of the narcissists in the 3 different clinics. What does it mean to be a neurotic narcissist? Something possibly healthy, because without this form of narcissism and identification with the ideal ego and the ego ideal, there wouldn't be any shift from the child into the adult. But then what does it mean that this narcissistic component shift into the pervert personality, and then finally into the schizophrenic subjectivity, which is the one we currently facing. Schizophrenic doesn't mean that we have all become literally schizophrenic, but that definitely we have, I believe, acquired a schizophrenic and narcissistic attitude towards reality as a defense mechanism because it's really overwhelming. And in all this, how possibly the built environment is caught in this network or trap, if you want to call it. That's why retrospectively I'm explaining the last section of the chapter is titled Rem Koolhaas explained to himself. I'm explaining some of the theories of Rem Koolhaas about junk space and what does it mean that we produce junk space possibly as the outcome of this identifying mechanism with these artificial environments that we have created.
I believe Igor's was next.
Okay,
Igor
thank
Feigen?
you. Yes, thank
Then
you.
Judith and then Quinn.
My question is for Professor Holm and regards Professor Holm's contribution. In particular, I was really fascinated by sort of the nature of the real that you put at the center of your ethics, or the ethics that you propose for a possible environmental architecture, so to speak. So if I understood you correctly, you focus your argument on what we can call a symbolic real, as in the real that manifests itself to us human in the symbolic. For example, as you were talking about the defects in the wall, it's something that thing that breaks the symbolic, but nevertheless it emerges and speaks to us as human. It's sort of the early Lacan real, like what always comes back to the same place. But then later Lacan opposes to this real, like in The Triumph of Religion, he talks about a real real or a true real, which is what he gets with matemes and formalization and so on and so forth. But what strikes me is that this real is much more inhuman. Like it has much less to do with us than the real, the symbolic real. And maybe I was wondering if that could correspond to what you call the wilderness in your diagrams. You have this wilderness that is radically outside. So my question is, if we want to put forward a non-human aesthetics, one that opposes itself to the one of NGO and the one that you critique, shouldn't we ground it on the real real rather than the symbolic real, which still is some sort of image that we have of nature and that we, create some sort of harmony? And then the following question is, if we ground something on this real real that is really has nothing to do with us, then those architectures still have a place, or is the role of architecture precisely to give meaning to this thing that we can't grasp? Thank you.
Wow. Right. A couple of things. I don't see, or perhaps just simply don't quite understand the progression of the real in Lacan's thought, or even the way that you've kind of articulated as a symbolic real. And I mean, there's a way that the real and the imaginary orders screen the symbolic and imaginary orders screen the real, and there are different ways that the real may erupt through it, erupt through that screen, kind of hammering to get out. And perhaps that's how I would kind of address your question. You were referring to my sort of plan diagrams, and like there is a difference between what I described as the wilderness, what was outside the city walls, well and truly outside those walls, versus another real, which is somehow inside those walls. In other words, there's the real, because I think the party wall is probably as close as architecture ever gets to imagining a real. It's lumpen. It can be decorated, but it's what's under the decorations. Okay, it's Piranesi, I think, understood that real, that when you strip, you know, the cladding, the 2 inches of limestone cladding off of Roman monuments, they lose all of their symbolic value. They simply become a kind of lump in masonry that's slowly in the rain melting back into the earth. So I think that's different than the wilderness, okay? Because it's somehow part of how architecture is configured, okay? It's a real that's somehow integral to the architecture, and as opposed to what I refer to as the wilderness, which is just something completely outside. And you know, I guess you would say that the the real that we're referring to as the wilderness is kind of beyond the ken of human occupation and relationships. I mean, it will always be, it's like a horizon. Wherever you are, it will be somehow beyond you. Okay. And that is different. And I don't know quite how to understand that, this kind of real that's somehow integrated, internal. Somehow there's the real which is outside of architecture, and this other real which is internal to it. Okay, that's different. They're different things. And I guess, you know, I guess if there's a analog to this and humans, and you know, if we move from architecture to humans, you know, there's the real of the body. You know, you slice a body open and guts come out, you know, and you recoil in horror. You know, there's that. And then there's something else which would correspond more to the 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 wilderness. And that would be something like I don't know what it would be, but imagine like if human social relations simply ceased to make any kind of sense at all. You know, they weren't even nonsense. They had just become noise. You know, human social relations, which say work primarily through the voice, and they just not even nonsense standing opposed to sense, but just kind of like they don't, it just simply wouldn't register. You know, I think maybe that would be a kind of totally externalized real, as opposed to a real which we might find within ourselves and be sort of internalized somehow. I don't know. Does that help? I'm thinking on my feet because I don't quite have the Lacan references to hand to give you a smart answer.
No, it was very helpful. Thank you. And you addressed the question, okay, but can architecture deal with this radically outside? And I guess the question is no, and that's okay.
Well, right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't probably no. Yeah. I mean, because, well, I don't know. I mean, surely if it can tame it, right? Sort of the Lewis and Clark expedition sails up, you know, the Missouri River, taming the wilderness as they go. Once it's tamed, it then just becomes civilization. And there's still something on the outside that there has to be. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I think Judith is on next.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. This has been most interesting. It gives me many associations to it, and then to architecture and its effect on one, and then the relations to Lacanian theory and what that brings to it. I wanted to give an example of an experience I had that I wondered where it might fit into this, but somewhere in my 50s, I was in a city I was in the city of Edinburgh in Scotland, having never been there before. And within a very few hours, started to walk around that city, mostly in the downtown area. And I felt as though I recognized so many buildings or the structure or the shape of the city that I was actually astonished because I don't have any kind of paranormal experiences, not even really spiritual experiences. And so when I think about that, my family and like 5 generations before came from Scotland, lowland Scotland, but not since. I'd never been to Edinburgh before. I had been to Glasgow. Had no reason to know why this would be so recognizable to me. And when I think about it from a Lacanian point of view, I'm sure you're right to think about it from a narcissistic point of view. But in this case, it wasn't really the ego ideal because it wasn't something that I thought of as grand or special. It was more from the narcissistic form of identity or recognition of identity, as though every corner I turned, I knew what I would be seeing next. And not in specifics, of course. So I don't know how common this experience is, but when I think about it, there are many architectural experiences that bring one to life. So thinking about what register it might be from, it's almost, in this experience anyway, it was a combination of the imaginary, of course, the visual, but then the symbolic from my own Protestant background, and then the real, because it was as real as though it came out and touched me. So I think this is extremely, like another concept in this area is, what is it in architecture that gives one the feeling of the sacred? And do only certain people have that feeling there? And therefore, what is that? And where does that show up among the real, imaginary, and the symbolic? So I think it's when we're looking for sources of support and recognition, the main Lacanian concept, I think architecture can be very important. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. Quinn Forsch?
Hello. Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you to all of you who have clearly worked very hard to bring these concepts out in print. I just wanted to make a comment for Lorens to ask if you were aware of Charles Melman's work on the party wall, the mur mitoyen, as a structure of psychosis. He talks about the dividing wall as something that, instead of creating a neighbor, creates a foreigner or some kind of enemy, but one that is very attached. So really just to bring that concept up for further interrogation if it interests you, but that's his first contribution to expanding Lacan's psychoanalytic theory. So thought I would bring that up.
Right. Could you just say, who was that?
Charles Melman.
Charles Melman. Is that the same Melman who, Jesus, what was it? Published a book on trompe l'oeil or something?
Melman came out of the original early Lacan group and formed one of those groups. The Cahiers is from that group. One of the groups, Jacques Alain formed one group, an association. There were about 4 major groups came out of that original Lacan group, and Charles Melman was the leader of one of those.
Right. Much to my chagrin, I'm not familiar with that work, but I need to go and read Charles Melman.
I think that you bring up a very important point, that the dividing wall is something that is quite psychoanalytic in its formation.
I mean, when you read party wall procedures, there's a recognition. I mean, if you're an architect, right? Like if you're building up against a party wall, okay, you're an owner and there's a building next to you and you're building up against it. It triggers all sorts of really special procedures for how to like, there's a recognition that you're into really, really fraught psychoanalytic territory. That it's a flashpoint between neighbors. Okay. And so but you're saying that Melman relates the party wall to psychosis. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
he talks about the difference between the Mobius band as a neurotic structure being
Yeah,
divided in half as a double strip topology, like the party wall would do,
yeah.
that creates a kind of foreign interference. I'll paste a link in the chat.
That I mean, I do cover quite a lot of that territory, at least such as you describe it, and but he might be doing it in a more informed way. I'd be very interested to read that stuff. But the idea that there's the wall is actually two separate surfaces, okay,
Hmm.
and really there's nothing in between. It's of no significance. Um, that's very clear to me, but I'm not quite sure I knew what to do with that. I mean, I did go to the idea of Mobius strips, but I
It sounds like it's very much in conversation with what he's saying, which is why I bring it up.
totally thank you so much for that. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Lorens.
Sure.
Other questions?
Did we wrap it up?
I I did want to say something to Judith Hamilton's comment, if I may. I mean, just I mean it's not exactly a psychoanalytic insight, but while you were talking, I mean, maybe it is, or maybe it isn't. I certainly, I'm not going to relate it to the symbolic, imaginary, and the real, is really all I mean. But while you were talking, I had this sudden sense that architecture repeats itself. Okay. And it's, it's actually entirely a practice of repetition. Okay. Not exactly that there's no originality anywhere, or that everything, we're doomed to be historicists or something. Nothing of the sort. But just that in a way that I'm not going to be able to elaborate here now, it is repetition. And maybe that's what you were recognizing or seeing. In other words, you know, I mean, repetition in the sense that if you're in a very strange land and, you know, and I don't mean an American in Edinburgh, but, an American in Timbuktu or something, you know what I mean? Really, somewhere that you might find quite alienating. Okay. Still, there's probably somewhere worse than Timbuktu, but when I was a kid, that was sort of Timbuktu was as far as the universe went. That was where on the maps, medieval maps, you had like strange figures in the borders. But anyway, what I wanted to say was, let's say you're in an extremely alienating place. There still is something there that's familiar, and that is like a building. It still has walls, windows, and doorways. Okay, and and still the hand of a person. It reflects human agency, and so there is a kind of repetition in that, and maybe you're simply recognizing architecture on a very deep level. I don't know. I just throw that out, but I won't elaborate on it.
If I could amplify that a bit, um, when people come up to Timbuktu, typically they feel the need to produce an architecture to mark their presence.
Hmm.
And to plug Jim Egan again, um, that was exactly what the Elizabethans were doing when they built a tower in Truro Park, was to mark their presence with something that was simultaneously um, a marker, a geodesic marker, but also an observatory, and as Jim found out, curiously, a camera obscura. That is, it did almost everything you could do with a building at a point where there was a margin to be had between the real of the world and the symbolic of the world. The nice thing about looking at architecture in regard to psychoanalysis is that it follows the practice of looking at the empirical in a Freudian way precisely to find the trashy parts. And Sam McCormick didn't ask me to plug him in any way, but I like his idea of trashitas. And of course, this intersects very much with Francesco's work. But really, we were really hoping to reach a Lacanian audience. It's not that we've given up entirely on the architecture audience to tell them they should start reading Lacan, because we've been doing that for 20 or so years, and it hasn't had a lot of effect. But Lacanians, I think, are better readers, and they are more diverse readers. And when they find a means of reading something about architecture that would make sense to them within the given frameworks of Lacan and Freud, I think there'll be a new kind of energy that comes out of it. I would like to also cite Iraj Guchani's study of Moorish doors in Spain, which inspired me to think that this was precisely the place we wanted to be taking both architecture, but especially psychoanalysis. So it's in this fruitful margin in between that we find a kind of particularity that yields itself especially to Lacan's way of thinking. So we're hoping that this book opens ways for Lacanians who may have no interest in architecture formally, but they find a convenient way to explore a new way of talking about Lacan's classic themes and interests. So I'll end my bit on that note. John, you and Francesco have something to tie up?
Caleb posted something on chat that you can get a softcover copy of the book for $30 at the Palgrave site. I definitely want to look into that.
Fantastic. Yes, at the very beginning of the chat, you'll find links to the Springer or Palgrave sites where you can get a discount code. So take a look at that. It's worth something.
If I can just add something to what you just said, Don, I'm not trying to project architecture from a Lacanian viewpoint. Actually, I'm trying to do the opposite. As an architect, I'm trying to radiate psychoanalysis from the viewpoints of architecture, meaning by this that I'm disappointed by the contemporary limited understanding of what architecture is supposed to be. And in this regard, I'm hoping to open a fecund relationship between architecture and psychoanalysis, but so many other different disciplines in a very holistic approach, which could be renaissance again, maybe a way to go back to the origin of this paradigm shift and get it right this time. If it's true as it's true that modernity hasn't happened yet.
Hey, I agree with that completely. I'm beginning to wonder if architecture intends to be anything at this point.
Listen, guys, I gotta run. I've got people at my door. So I'm just gonna, without ceremony, say goodbye. Igor, thanks so much for your comments. And I hope perhaps to expand on that at some point. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Cornelia.
Thanks,
I
Lawrence.
think we're there. But I've got to run. No, we're having a degree show.
Bye, Lawrence.
Take care. Bye. Hi. I'm here. Wait.
You know, we might use Lorens as a hint that it's a good time to tie up things.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I will get back to you on the status of the recording.
Yes, please. I'd like to see you.
Okay.